my fiancé said softly during our train ride across Switzerland. I'm afraid marriage might limit my dreams. I told her dreams should always come first, shifted my career path the same week, and eventually she noticed my name attached to something unexpected. I'm afraid marriage might limit my dreams. She said it so quietly, I almost missed it beneath the sound of the train cutting through the mountain air. Almost. The Swiss countryside was bleeding gold outside the window, the kind of gold that only exists in places people visit when they're trying to feel something or trying to forget something. I wasn't sure which one we were doing anymore. Her hand was resting on the small table between us, fingers curled loosely around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched in 40 minutes. I looked at her hand first. Then I looked at her face. Celeste was staring out at the Alps like they owed her an answer, her jaw set in that particular way it gets when she's already made a decision but hasn't yet decided to tell you about it. I knew that jaw. I had loved that jaw for 3 years. I cleared my throat carefully, the way you do when you're trying not to startle something you might scare away forever. What do you mean? I asked. She turned slowly, and her eyes, gray in certain lights, almost green in others, were dry, which somehow felt worse than if she'd been crying. I mean exactly what I said, she told me. I love you. I do. But I keep thinking about the film I want to make, the places I want to go, the years I want to spend doing something that matters before I settle into anything permanent. She paused, and then added the word that really did the damage. Permanent. Like our engagement ring was a door being locked from the outside. Like I was the lock. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. We were 28 and 27 respectively, engaged for 11 months, sharing a flat in Edinburgh that smelled like old timber and espresso. The Switzerland trip had been my idea, a combined birthday and anniversary trip, the kind of thing you plan with spreadsheets and excitement, the kind of thing that feels romantic on paper and slightly desperate in hindsight. I was an architectural designer working at a mid-sized firm. She was an aspiring documentary filmmaker who had spent the last 2 years building a portfolio that was, honestly, remarkable. Short films about migrant fishing communities, a piece about a vanishing dialect in the Faroe Islands, another one about a blind cartographer in Prague. She was extraordinarily talented. That was never the question. The question, sitting there on that train with the Alps watching us both, was whether I had somehow, without meaning to, without realizing it, become something she needed to escape from. I didn't say anything right away. That's important, I think. Because in that moment, every instinct I had was screaming at me to argue, to explain, to make a case for myself the way you'd make a case in a planning meeting, presenting data, drawing timelines, demonstrating feasibility. We can make this work. I'll be flexible. We don't have to set a date yet. We don't have to do anything you're not ready for. All of that was sitting right there behind my teeth. But I swallowed it. Because something about the way she said limit stopped me cold. Not change my dreams. Not delay my dreams. Limit. Like I was a ceiling. Like the life we'd been quietly building together was a room with no windows. I looked back out at the mountains. They were enormous and indifferent, which felt appropriate. What kind of film? I finally asked. She blinked. Sorry, the film you want to make. The one you're thinking about when you say all this. She stared at me for a second, and something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like she'd been braced for an argument, and the absence of one had thrown her slightly off balance. A full-length documentary, she said, slowly. About the resettlement camps along the northern coast of Norway. There's a community there, 3 generations of people who've been displaced 3 different times for 3 different reasons. I've been in contact with a local fixer for months. She said months with a particular weight. As if to make clear this wasn't a thought she'd had on the train. This was a plan. How long would you need to be there? I asked. Minimum 8 months. Realistically, closer to a year. Okay, I said. She frowned. Okay. Dreams should come first, Celeste, I said, and I meant it with every single ounce of sincerity I had. Not careers. Not timelines. Not engagement calendars or wedding venues or whatever else we've been quietly stressing about for the last 6 months. I leaned forward slightly. If this is the film you need to make, then you should make it. She looked at me like I'd just said something in a language she'd been studying for years, but never actually expected to hear spoken aloud. You're not upset, she said. I'm not upset. You're not going to ask me to reconsider. No. Why? And I told her the truest thing I could think of, right there on that train with the Alps still watching and the coffee still cooling. Because if being with me is the reason you don't make that film, you'll spend the rest of your life quietly resenting me for it. And I'd rather lose the version of us I imagine than watch you lose the version of yourself you're supposed to become. She was quiet for a very long time after that. The train moved through a tunnel, and for about 40 seconds we were in total darkness, and I sat very still and tried not to think too hard about what that meant. We flew home 3 days later. The remaining days in Switzerland had been strange, gentle, even warm in stretches, but threaded through with the specific awkwardness of two people who've said something that cannot be unsaid, who are circling the thing rather than touching it directly. We held hands at the hotel. We split a bottle of wine over dinner on the second night and laughed at something on television and fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, and for a few hours it felt almost like nothing had changed. Almost. But something had changed. I knew it the way you know a hairline crack in a load-bearing wall. You can't always see it, but you can feel it in the way the structure breathes. The Monday after we got back, I walked into my firm and asked to meet with Graham, the senior partner who'd been mentoring me since I joined 5 years ago. Graham was 61, perpetually sunburned, and had spent his career designing civic spaces, parks, libraries, community centers, in a way that made you believe architecture could actually do something good for people. He was the reason I'd taken the job in the first place. I sat down in his office, and before he could ask how the holiday was, I told him I needed to step back from the Reykjavik proposal. He put down his pen. The Reykjavik proposal was, in practical terms, the biggest thing our firm had been invited to pitch on in 6 years. It was a mixed-use waterfront regeneration project, several acres of redeveloped coastline, new public promenade, residential integration, the whole package. I'd been named as the lead designer. It would have required me to spend 14 months on site in Iceland, beginning in January. Graham stared at me the way older men stare at younger ones when they suspect they're about to do something irreversible for the wrong reasons. "Talk to me," he said. "It's personal," I told him. "Everything's personal," he replied. "That doesn't explain anything." I took a breath. Someone I love is about to pursue something important. It's going to take a year, maybe more. And I don't want to be across 2 countries from them while that's happening. I want to be present. Available. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is she asking you to do this?" "No," I said. "She doesn't know I'm doing this." He picked his pen back up, tapped it once on the desk. "Then you might be making a sacrifice on behalf of someone who hasn't asked for it and may not appreciate it." "That's possible," I said. "But it's still the right call for me." He studied me for a long moment, and then he did something I didn't expect. He nodded. Not enthusiastically, not with endorsement, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who has seen enough of life to know when someone has made up their mind. "Owen can take the lead on Reykjavik," he said. "You'll stay on the team in a support capacity, remote. That way you don't lose the credential entirely." "That's more than fair," I said. "It is," he agreed. "Don't waste it." I didn't tell Celeste. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. I didn't do it as a gesture to hold over her. I didn't do it expecting her to find out and be moved by the sacrifice. I did it because what she'd said on that train had unlocked something in me. Not grief, not anger, but a kind of clarity that felt overdue. I had been so focused on building a life towards something. The promotion, the flagship project, the timeline that looked reasonable on the outside, that I'd forgotten to ask whether the direction of it actually meant anything to me. The Reykjavik project was prestigious, but when I was honest with myself, sitting alone in our flat that Monday evening while Celeste was on a call with her Norwegian fixer, I realized I had wanted it mostly because it was the kind of thing you're supposed to want. The career milestone. The international credit. The thing that earns you a seat at a different table. Graham's voice from my interview, 5 years ago, drifted back to me. Architecture should serve people. The moment it starts serving your ego instead, you've lost the thread. I'd been losing the thread. So I made a different decision. In the weeks that followed, I started working on something I'd been quietly sketching in notebooks for almost 2 years. A proposal for a community-centered redesign of a neglected green space in one of Edinburgh's most underfunded neighborhoods. Pilrig Park area. Not glamorous. Not a career maker in the traditional sense. But it was a genuine problem that real people were living inside, and I had actual ideas about how to address it. I began working on it in the evenings, after dinner, while Celeste edited footage or made calls or sat across the flat with her headphones on, deep in whatever world she was building on her laptop screen. I'm not going to pretend those weeks were hard. They weren't, actually. There was something almost peaceful about having a clear, honest purpose again, a project that didn't require me to perform ambition, but just to use what I actually knew. I felt, for the first time in a while, like myself. Celeste left for Norway in February. We didn't break the engagement before she left. We didn't really discuss it, either, which I now understand was its own kind of answer. She hugged me at the departure gate for a long time, her chin pressed against my shoulder, and I held her and breathed in the smell of her hair and tried not to make the moment into something it wasn't. "I'll call when I land," she said. "I know you will," I said. She pulled back and looked at me, and her eyes were doing that gray-green thing, and she said quietly, "Thank you for not making me feel guilty." I almost said something important right then. I almost said, "I've been thinking about us. About what you said on the train. About whether you already know how this ends, and you're just being kind by not saying it yet." Instead, I said, "Safe travels, Celeste." She walked through the gate. I watched her go until I couldn't see her anymore, and then I stood there for another minute or so, and then I went home. The calls were regular in the beginning. Every 2 or 3 days, she'd ring from whatever location her team had set up for the day, once from a converted fishing shed, once from a community hall with a leaking roof, once from the front seat of a truck parked on a cliff road with the north seat enormous and gray behind her. She was glowing. That's the only word for it. There was an aliveness in her face on those video calls that I hadn't seen in months, maybe longer, and the cruel, honest part of me had to admit that some of what I was feeling wasn't just happiness for her. Some of it was grief. Not because she was thriving, but because the thing that was making her thrive was so clearly the absence of everything we had built together. Not me, specifically, but the structure of us. The routine, the expectations, the gentle mutual gravity of two people sharing a life. She was breathing better without it. I could see it in every frame of the calls. I started going to bed earlier on the nights she didn't call, rather than staying up waiting. That was the first real shift. Somewhere around March, the calls became less frequent. Not dramatically. Nothing was ever dramatically stated between us, which was perhaps the most painful thing about the entire situation. It was gradual. Once a week instead of twice. Then once every 10 days. Then she sent a voice message at 2 in the morning one Friday explaining that the filming schedule had intensified, and she might be quieter for a stretch, and she was sorry, and she missed me, and she was learning things about people that were changing how she thought about everything. I listened to the message 3 times. The part that stayed with me was changing how she thought about everything. Everything. Not some things. Not specific things. Everything. I sat with that word for a while. Then I went back to my notebook. Owen rang me in late March, which he didn't do often. Owen was the colleague who'd taken over the Reykjavik lead, a lanky, meticulous man from Galway who communicated mostly through architectural drawings and extremely dry observations about other people's life choices. "How's the passion project?" he asked when I picked up. "Progressing," I said. "Graham mentioned it at the team meeting." I paused. "Did he?" "Said you were working on something for Pilrig. Community regeneration thing." "Yeah," I said carefully. "Still early." "He also said he'd submitted an expression of interest to the Edinburgh City Council on your behalf," Owen said. There was a beat of silence. "He did what?" I said. "Without telling you, apparently." "Very Graham. Are you angry?" I thought about it. "No," I said slowly. "I don't think I am." "Good," said Owen. "Because they responded." I rang Graham that evening. "You submitted my work to the council," I said, without preamble. "Yes," he said, equally without preamble. "Why?" "Because it's the best thing you've designed in 3 years," he said. "The Reykjavik proposal was technically impressive and creatively empty," he said. "I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because it's true, and because you know it's true, and because the Pilrig work has something that one didn't." He paused. "It has a reason." I didn't say anything for a moment. "What did the council say?" I asked. "They want a full presentation. 2nd week of April." I sat down. "Graham, you can say thank you," he said. "And then you can go prepare the best presentation of your professional life." I almost said thank you. Instead I said, "Did you do this because of what I told you about stepping back from Reykjavik?" Another pause, longer this time. "I did it because the work is good," he said carefully. "What you told me in my office gave me enough context to understand where the work came from. That's not the same thing." But, he said, in that tone that meant he was about to say something that would sit with me for a long time. "I also think that sometimes the decision that looks like sacrifice is actually just the decision that points you toward the right door. And I wanted to make sure the door was open before you walked past it." I held the phone for a long moment after we hung up. Then I opened my notebook and started working. The April presentation went well. Better than well, honestly. I stood in a council chamber in front of 7 people who were fully accustomed to being bored by architects, and I showed them something I'd actually thought about. A redesign that integrated a community food garden, a covered outdoor performance and gathering area, a children's nature pathway that connected to the adjacent school, and a small, permanent public art installation designed collaboratively with local residents. The entire scheme had been drawn up using a community consultation process I'd run voluntarily over the preceding 6 weeks, 12 sessions in community halls and libraries, speaking with families, elderly residents, teenagers, local business owners. I knew every person whose input had shaped the proposal. I could name them. One of the council members stopped me near the end of the presentation and asked, "How many community sessions did you run for this?" 12, I said. "And how many were attended by residents rather than just stakeholders?" "All 12, I said. She made a note. 3 weeks later, I received a letter confirming that the proposal had been selected for development funding. My name was on the letter. My name was in the accompanying press release. My name was in the brief article that ran in a small urban planning publication 2 weeks after that. The kind of publication that most people have never heard of, but that people working in architecture and design tend to read. I didn't send the article to anyone. I posted it to the firm's internal server, updated my professional profile, and went to meet Owen for a beer to celebrate what he described as quietly the most useful thing anyone at this firm has done in the past 4 years. I didn't tell Celeste, partly because things between us had arrived at a specific kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like aftermath, and partly because, honestly, it had stopped being the kind of news I thought about sharing with her first. That realization sat with me for several days. The last real conversation we had, the last one where both of us were actually present, actually saying things, happened in early May, 6 weeks after the council confirmation. She rang on a Sunday evening. The Norwegian light was still going at 10 o'clock behind her, and she looked tired and luminous at the same time, the way people do when they're doing the thing they're supposed to be doing even though it's costing them something. We talked about the film for a while. She had enough material, she thought, for something that could genuinely travel. Festivals, broadcasters, the whole circuit. She talked about a woman she'd been documenting named Astrid, 91 years old, who had been displaced from her village 3 separate times, and who still kept a clay tile from the floor of her original home in a cloth bag she carried everywhere. Celeste's voice changed when she talked about Astrid. It went quiet and careful, the way voices go around something irreplaceable. I listened, and I felt, very purely, glad for her. Not complicated. Not performative, just glad. Then she said, "How are you? You've been quiet." "I've been working on something," I said. "Reykjavik?" "No, something local. It got funded." "Oh," she said. That's great. I'm glad." There was a pause. Then she said, carefully, the way she'd said things on the train, "I think we both know." I looked at the ceiling. "Yeah," I said. "I think we do." "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," I said, and meant it, which surprised us both slightly. "I still love you," she said. Just not in the way that works," I finished gently. Another pause. "No," she said, very quietly. "Not in the way that works." We talked for another 20 minutes after that, about nothing important, the kind of conversation that exists to give 2 people time to arrive at the ending without either of them having to sprint toward it. And then she said goodbye, and I said goodbye, and that was that. I won't say the weeks that followed were easy. They weren't. There's a particular kind of loss that doesn't feel like grief, exactly. More like the removal of a background sound you'd gotten so used to you'd stopped noticing it, until suddenly the quiet is very loud. I noticed it at dinner. I noticed it on Sunday mornings. I noticed it when I boiled the kettle and made a single cup instead of 2. Small things. But they added up in the evening, in the specific hour between 9 and 10 when the flat was quiet and I hadn't yet decided to sleep. I ran more than I had in years. I cooked, badly, experimentally, the way you do when there's no one else's preferences to account for. I worked on the Pilrig project with a focus that I think came, at least partly, from needing to put the energy somewhere. Owen rang once a week. Graham checked in through internal memos about the project development, which was his way of checking in on me without either of us having to acknowledge it. I appreciated that more than I said. The thing about architecture, the thing Graham had taught me years ago, is that you're always designing for someone else's future. You never live in the buildings you design. You never sit in the gardens you plan or stand in the doorways you've drawn 100 times from 100 angles. You build forward into lives you'll never directly inhabit, and then you step back, and the work becomes someone else's present, someone else's ordinary Tuesday. I had always found that slightly melancholy. That year, for the first time, I found it freeing. By summer, the Qley regeneration project had moved into the public consultation and detailed design phase, and I had a small team, 2 junior designers, an intern from the architecture school, and a landscape specialist named Petra who had opinions about native plant species that were, I gradually came to understand, both correct and entirely non-negotiable. Petra was organized, direct, occasionally exhausting, and one of the finest professional collaborators I'd worked with. She had no patience for vagueness, which pushed everyone, including me, to be precise about everything, every material decision, every sight line, every square meter of proposed change. Why does this path curve here? She'd ask, pointing at a drawing. Because it follows the natural gradient of the ground, I'd say. Does it? Or does it follow your preference for a curve? Does it matter if the outcome is the same? It matters because one is honest and one isn't. That became, without us planning it, the working philosophy of the whole project. Be honest about what you're doing and why you're doing it. The design work was some of the most satisfying I'd done in years. Celeste finished principal filming in September. She sent a message on a Tuesday evening. Wrap today. Flying home in a week. Really proud of what we made. I replied, you should be. Genuinely. She sent a small heart emoji. That was the last message we exchanged for a long time. I should tell you about the moment she found out, because it's the part that people always expect to be cinematic, and the reality of it was much smaller and stranger than that. It was November. The Qley project had been moving through its final design review, and a piece had run in a regional arts and culture magazine. Not a major publication by any measure, but the kind of thing that circulates in local creative and professional communities, the kind of thing people leave on coffee tables in waiting rooms and share in specific professional groups online. The piece was about community-led architecture in British cities. My name was mentioned in 2 paragraphs. There was a photograph of the proposed park, rendered in that particular autumn afternoon light, and beside it a quote from one of the council members about the consultation process, and somewhere in the middle of the second paragraph, lead designer, who stepped away from a high-profile international commission earlier this year to develop this community-rooted proposal. That line, I'd had nothing to do with. The journalist had found it in the council's project notes. I hadn't thought much about it. Celeste's name appeared in my phone on a Thursday evening in November, 8 months after she'd left for Norway, and about a week after the magazine piece had run. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I picked up. Hey, she said. Hey, I said. A pause. I saw the article, she said. Okay, I said. Another pause. The line about the International Commission, she said, and her voice had something careful in it, something edged. What about it? Was that, she stopped. Started again. Was that the Reykjavik project? I thought for a moment about deflecting. Yes, I said. A long silence. You gave that up, she said. While we were still engaged, yes. I didn't ask you to do that. I know you didn't. Then why? She asked, and her voice had shifted into something that wasn't anger exactly, but was close to it. The specific emotion of someone who has discovered a piece of information that reframes a story they thought they understood. I leaned back and thought carefully about how to answer honestly. Because what you said on that train made me realize I'd been chasing things for the wrong reasons, I said. Not for you. That's not what this is. But you saying what you said cracked something open that probably needed cracking. I feel like she said and stopped. Celeste, I feel like I cost you something. You gave me something, I said, without drama, without performance. A much better project. A much clearer head. The best working year I've had in a long time. Silence. The park looks beautiful, she said, finally quietly. It will be, I said. The plants aren't in yet. Petra is very particular about the plants. A small, surprised sound that might have been a laugh. Then, are you okay? Yeah, I said. I genuinely am. Good, she said. I'm glad. She paused once more, and I could feel her composing something, the way you could always feel it with Celeste. There was always a layer below the layer she was speaking from. I'm sorry, she said. About how it went. About the fact that I think I knew before the train and I said it that way anyway. In a setting, with scenery, like I was staging it. I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe I should have. Probably true, I said honestly. But I don't think it changes anything. No. The conversation was real, even if the timing was considered. That's very gracious, she said. It's just accurate, I replied. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she needed to go. She had a meeting with a distribution contact about the documentary, and I said that was great, and she said it might be nothing, and I said something good would happen for it, and I meant that too. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, Celeste. And that was, really, the end of it. The Pilrig Park opened in the following spring, the first Tuesday of April, which was also the day the ornamental cherry trees were in approximate full bloom, which Petra had predicted with an accuracy I found unsettling and impressive in equal measure. There were maybe 60 people at the opening. A local counselor spoke briefly. A woman from the community consultation who had 3 children at the adjacent school said a few words. Graham stood at the back with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the expression it does when he's proud of something but has no intention of admitting it publicly. Owen took a photograph of me standing in front of the completed performance shelter and later used it as the firm's header image on their website for 7 months, which I told him was excessive and he pointed out was accurate. I walked the whole site alone for about 20 minutes after most people had drifted off. The food garden was bare in April still, green beds waiting for their summer planting, the beds bordered by low stone walls that 2 residents from the consultation had helped design themselves, literally sat at a table with me for 3 hours and picked the stone and the dimensions and the pattern. The children's nature pathway curved through a stand of birch trees, following the natural ground as Petra had insisted it must, and the light came through the branches in the particular dappled way it does in early April when the leaves are just barely out. Not full yet, but present, the light still finding the gaps. I stood there for a while. I thought about the train. I thought about the Alps and the cold coffee, and Celeste's jaw set in the way it gets when she's already decided. I thought about what she'd given me, not intentionally, not as a gift, but given me nonetheless. I thought about Graham's voice on the phone. Sometimes the decision that looks like sacrifice is actually just the decision that points you toward the right door. I thought about Astrid, whom I'd never met, carrying a clay tile from her original home in a cloth bag everywhere she went, carrying the place where she came from, wherever she ended up. There's something in that. I've thought about it a lot since. People ask me, when I tell this story, whether I'm still angry. I'm not. I want to be honest about that, because I know the easy version of the story, the one that feels satisfying, is the one where the sacrifice made me bitter and the success felt like revenge. It didn't. The success felt like arriving somewhere I should have been aiming for all along. The sacrifice wasn't a sacrifice, in the end. It was a correction. Celeste's documentary premiered at an international film festival that following autumn. I know this because Owen read about it and sent me the link with a single-word message. Wow. I watched the trailer online. She'd done something extraordinary. The film opened on Astrid, 91 years old, sitting at a window in the community hall, holding the cloth bag in her lap, and she said something in Norwegian that was subtitled below. I have been moved 3 times, but I have never left. The place is in me. It comes wherever I go. I watched it twice. Then I closed the laptop and made dinner and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Here's the thing I actually learned. Not the lesson you'd expect me to lead with, not the one that sounds good in a summary. It's this. People tell you the truth when they're scared. Celeste told me the truth on that train because she was afraid. Not afraid of me. Afraid of herself, of what she wanted, of the gap between the life she was moving toward and the life she could feel pulling at her from the future she needed. She didn't say it perfectly, and the timing was, as she later admitted, somewhat staged. But it was true. And the thing about truth, even when it costs you something, is that it has a direction. It points somewhere. You can follow it, or you can spend your energy arguing with it, trying to negotiate it back into a shape you're more comfortable with. I followed it. Not because I'm admirable, not because I had it figured out, but because somewhere in the silence of that train, with the mountains outside and the coffee cooling and the ring still on her finger, I understood, even if I couldn't have named it then, that her truth was trying to point me toward mine. A park where children walk through birch trees in April. The light finding the gaps. A community consultation that actually consulted the community. A job I did for a reason. That's what was on the other side of the train ride. That's what was on the other side of the fear. I'm telling this story because someone in my life recently asked me whether I regret the decisions I made that year. The stepping back. The local project instead of the international one. The choice to mean something over the choice to matter somewhere prestigious. I told them no, and I meant it. But I also told them this. I don't think I deserve credit for wisdom. I think I stumbled into clarity because someone I loved was honest with me in a way that happened to crack something loose. That's luck, to a large extent. Or maybe it's just what happens when you stop arguing with the truth long enough to hear what it's actually saying. The ring is in a drawer in my flat. I don't have a ceremonious story about it. It's just there. Sometimes I notice it. It doesn't make me sad. It makes me think about the train and the mountains and the coffee and the very specific quality of being told something honest by someone who loves you and is afraid at the same time. There's a kind of tenderness in that, even now, even in the ending of it. The park is full on summer evenings. I've gone back a few times, the way you go back to places you've had a hand in, half curious and half unable to stay away. There are always children on the nature path. There are always people in the food garden, arguing over whether the courgettes are ready, mostly, which is apparently a universal and endless debate among community gardeners. The Performance Shelter hosts a small local choir on Wednesday evenings in June and July. They're not exceptionally good, but they're genuinely, happily there, in a space that didn't exist before, and the sound of them drifts across the park in the long evening light, and you can hear it from the bench by the birch trees where I usually sit. I've never introduced myself to anyone there. They don't need to know my name. The point was never my name. The point was the light through the branches, and the sound of the choir, and the clay tile and the cloth bag. The point was always the place itself.